The dust swirled across the barren Texas landscape as Irwin squinted against the harsh afternoon sun, his weathered hand adjusting the brim of his hat. The year was 1874, and the stretch of land between Brownsville and the Mexican border had become notorious for lawlessness that even the Texas Rangers couldn't fully contain. Ethan wasn't a ranger, not officially, but he'd been riding these parts long enough to know trouble when he saw it. And the scene unfolding ahead of him was nothing short of trouble. A small caravan had stopped near a dried-up creek bed. 3 wagons formed a loose triangle, and within that space stood a makeshift auction block, nothing more than a flat wooden platform raised on barrels. What turned Ethan's stomach was the sight of 5 women bound to one of the wagons, ropes around their wrists, their faces displaying varying degrees of fear and defiance. Ethan dismounted from his chestnut mare, Thunder, and led her behind a large boulder. He counted 7 men, rough-looking sorts with an assortment of weapons. From his vantage point, he could hear snippets of their conversation carried on the wind. "Start the bidding at $50 for the Mexican one," a burly man with a thick beard shouted. "She's young and strong, good for work or whatever else you fancy." Crude laughter followed, and Ethan felt a familiar anger rising within him. Human trafficking had become increasingly common along the border, especially after the war, with desperate people being captured and sold into various forms of servitude. He studied the women more carefully. 4 appeared to be of Mexican descent, likely captured during a raid across the border. But the 5th woman caught his attention immediately. She stood straighter than the others, her auburn hair gleaming with reddish highlights in the sun despite the dust and grime that covered her. She wore a torn dress that might once have been fine, and though her face was partially obscured by her hair, Ethan could see she was surveying her surroundings, clearly looking for any opportunity to escape. This wasn't the first auction Ethan had broken up, and he knew he couldn't simply charge in, not with those odds. He checked his Colt revolver and Winchester rifle, formulating a plan. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the terrain, Ethan made his move. He approached the camp on foot, keeping to the growing shadows. Thunder left safely tied some distance away. The auction had already begun, with 2 of the women already sold to members of the group. When he was close enough, Ethan lit the small bundle of dynamite he'd been carrying, a trick he'd learned during the war. He threw it far from the women, but close enough to the men to cause chaos. The explosion rocked the camp. Men scrambled for cover, reaching for weapons as dirt and debris rained down. In the confusion, Ethan charged forward, firing his Winchester with deadly accuracy. 2 men fell immediately, and a 3rd clutched his shoulder, howling in pain. "It's a damned ambush." Someone yelled, and several of the men scattered, diving for cover behind wagons and rocks. Ethan used the moment to rush toward the wagon where the women were bound. The auburn-haired woman locked eyes with him, surprise and wariness evident in her expression. "Get down." Ethan shouted as he fired again, dropping another man who had emerged from behind a wagon with a shotgun. Bullets whizzed past him as he reached the women. With his hunting knife, he quickly cut the ropes binding the auburn-haired woman. "You're free because I'm here," he said tersely, pressing the knife into her hand. "Cut the others loose while I provide cover." Without waiting for a response, Ethan turned and fired at a man charging toward them. The woman didn't hesitate. She immediately began sawing at the ropes binding the woman next to her. "My name's Tessa Morgan," she said breathlessly as she worked. "Who are you?" "Ethan Irwin," he replied, reloading his Winchester. "Explanations later. We need to get all of you out of here now." The remaining traffickers were regrouping, using one of the wagons as cover as they returned fire. Ethan knew their window of opportunity was closing rapidly. As Tessa freed the last woman, Ethan spotted their best chance. One of the wagons was hitched and ready, its horses skittish but still in place after the explosion. "That wagon," he said, pointing. "All of you get in, stay low." Ethan provided covering fire as Tessa led the other women to the wagon. One of the Mexican women was limping badly, supported by 2 others. Ethan rushed to help, half carrying the injured woman to the wagon bed. "Can you drive?" he asked Tessa as they reached the wagon. I can, she responded confidently, climbing up to the driver's seat. Head north. I'll be right behind you. Ethan fired several more shots to keep the traffickers pinned down, then whistled sharply. Moments later, Thunder came galloping toward him from where he'd left her trained to respond to his call. As Tessa snapped the reins and the wagon lurched forward, Ethan mounted Thunder in one fluid motion and rode alongside, continuing to fire at their pursuers until the wagon picked up speed, racing away from the makeshift auction site. They drove hard for nearly an hour, the women huddled in the wagon bed before Ethan signaled for Tessa to slow down. They hadn't been followed, but he remained vigilant, frequently checking their back trail. There's a small homestead about 2 miles ahead, Ethan said, riding close to the wagon. Belongs to a widow named Mrs. Abernathy. She'll help us. Tessa nodded, her hands tight on the reins. In the fading light, Ethan could see that, beneath the dirt and exhaustion, she was strikingly beautiful, with high cheekbones and eyes the color of sage. But what impressed him most was the composure she maintained despite the ordeal she must have endured. Thank you, she said simply, her voice steady. Those men, they attacked our stagecoach 3 days ago, killed the driver and the guard. The other passengers were men, they killed them too. I'm sorry, Ethan said, genuinely meaning it. No one should have to endure what you've been through. They were taking us to Mexico, one of the other women spoke up, her English heavily accented, to sell us to a man they called El Cuchillo. The knife, Ethan translated grimly. I've heard of him. Runs a network of brothels south of the border. Tessa's face hardened. We would have died before submitting to such a fate. Ethan believed her. There was a steel in her eyes that matched the determination in her voice. They reached Mrs. Abernathy's homestead just as night fully descended. It was a modest place, a sturdy cabin with a small barn and corral, surrounded by a vegetable garden protected by a wooden fence. A lantern burned in the window, casting a warm glow across the yard. Mrs. Abernathy herself came out onto the porch at the sound of their approach, a shotgun held ready in her gnarled hands. She was in her 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, her face a roadmap of wrinkles earned through decades of frontier life. Ethan Irwin, is that you? She called, lowering the shotgun slightly. It's me, Mrs. Abernathy, Ethan confirmed, dismounting. I've brought some folks who need help. The old woman's eyes widened as she took in the wagon full of women. Without further questions, she propped her shotgun against the porch railing and hurried down the steps. Bring them inside, she said briskly. Lord have mercy, you poor dears look half dead. Over the next hour, Mrs. Abernathy transformed into a whirlwind of activity. She heated water for baths, pulled out clean dresses and nightgowns from an old trunk, and set a massive pot of stew to warming on the stove. The injured Mexican woman, whose name was Lucia, had her ankle wrapped and was given the only proper bed in the house. The others would sleep on pallets in the main room. Tessa, freshly bathed and dressed in a simple blue dress that was slightly too large for her frame, sat at Mrs. Abernathy's table, cradling a cup of hot coffee between her hands. Her auburn hair, now clean, fell in waves past her shoulders. Ethan found himself watching her more often than was probably proper. You said your name is Tessa Morgan, he asked, taking a seat across from her while Mrs. Abernathy fussed over the other women. She nodded. I was traveling from Boston to meet my uncle in San Antonio. He's my only living relative, and after my father died last year, he invited me to come live with him. Her voice caught slightly. I don't even know if he knows what happened to me. San Antonio's a 4-day ride from here, Ethan said. Once you've all had some rest, I can escort you there. You've already done so much, Tessa protested. Surely you have your own business to attend to. My business can wait, Ethan replied simply. He didn't mention that his business largely consisted of hunting down men exactly like the ones they'd escaped from men who preyed on the vulnerable along the frontier. Tessa studied him curiously. You're not just a passing cowboy, are you, Mr. Irwin? You knew exactly what to do back there. Ethan smiled faintly. I was a scout for the Union Army during the war. Afterward, I rode with the Rangers for a spell. These days, I mostly work on my own. A vigilante, she asked, a hint of disapproval in her voice. I prefer to think of myself as someone who helps where help is needed, he countered. The law doesn't always reach far enough out here. Tessa considered this, then nodded slowly. Well, I'm grateful you were there today, regardless of your usual occupation. Their conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Abernathy, who set down 2 bowls of stew in front of them. Eat, she commanded. Then rest. You've all had enough excitement for one day. As they ate, Ethan learned more about Tessa. She was 24 years old, educated at a women's college in Massachusetts, and had worked as a teacher before her father's death. Her uncle, William Morgan, was a banker in San Antonio who had written to her of opportunities for educated women in the growing Texas cities. And what about you? She asked eventually. You know my story, but I know very little about you beyond your skill with firearms. Ethan hesitated. He rarely spoke about himself, especially his past, but something about Tessa's direct gaze compelled honesty. I grew up in Tennessee, he began. My father was a blacksmith, taught me the trade, but I always had itchy feet. When the war came, I enlisted with the Union, much to my father's dismay, Tennessee being Confederate territory and all. That must have been difficult, Tessa said softly. Ethan nodded. Haven't been back since. After the war, I drifted west. Worked as a cowhand, a scout, tried my hand at prospecting for a while. Nothing stuck until I joined the Rangers. That suited me for a time, but I found I worked better alone. And now I go where I'm needed, Ethan said simply. There's no shortage of trouble in these parts, and sometimes a man riding alone can do what a company of lawmen can't. Tessa seemed about to ask another question when one of the other women approached, speaking rapidly in Spanish. Ethan understood enough to know that Lucia's condition had worsened. Her ankle was swelling badly, and she had developed a fever. Mrs. Abernathy confirmed the diagnosis. That ankle might be broken, not just sprained, she said worriedly, and I fear infection is setting in. She needs a proper doctor. Brownsville's the closest town with a doctor, Ethan said, calculating distances in his head. We could be there by midday tomorrow if we leave at first light. I'll prepare bandages and willow bark tea for the journey, Mrs. Abernathy said, already moving toward her herb cabinet. That night, Ethan slept on the porch, his rifle close at hand. Though he doubted the traffickers would find them here, he wasn't taking any chances. Inside, Tessa lay awake on her pallet near the fireplace, listening to the soft breathing of the other women and the occasional creak of the floorboards as Ethan patrolled outside. She thought about the strange turn her life had taken, how quickly her journey to a new beginning had transformed into a nightmare, and then, just as suddenly, into something else entirely. The image of Ethan charging into the camp, risking his life to save 5 strangers, stayed with her. There was something about him that intrigued her, a combination of hardness and compassion that seemed rare in her experience. Morning came all too quickly. After a hasty breakfast, they prepared for the journey to Brownsville. The wagon was repacked, with a space made comfortable for Lucia with blankets and pillows. Mrs. Abernathy provided them with food for the journey and extra bandages for Lucia's ankle. You be careful now, the old woman said, embracing Tessa. These are dangerous times, especially for women alone. We're not alone, Tessa replied, looking toward Ethan, who was checking the wagon's wheels and axles. We have a very capable escort. Mrs. Abernathy followed her gaze and smiled knowingly. Indeed you do. Ethan Irwin is a good man, though he tries to hide it behind that gruff exterior. They set off as the sun crested the horizon, Ethan riding alongside the wagon as Tessa handled the reins. The other women, Alina, Sophia, and Maria, sat in the back with Lucia, who drifted in and out of consciousness despite the willow bark tea they'd given her for the fever and pain. The journey to Brownsville was tense but uneventful. They stuck to main roads, and Ethan kept a vigilant eye on their surroundings. Occasionally, they passed other travelers, mostly farmers or traders heading to or from town, but no one who raised Ethan's suspicions. As they rode, Tessa found herself watching Ethan whenever he wasn't looking her way. There was an ease to how he sat his horse, a natural grace that spoke of years in the saddle. His face, partly shaded by his hat, was all angles and planes, with a strong jaw covered in stubble that was somewhere between brown and red. He wasn't conventionally handsome, but there was something compelling about him, a quiet strength that drew her attention. "You're staring, Miss Morgan," Ethan said without looking at her, a hint of amusement in his voice. Tessa felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I was just thinking about how strange life can be," she said honestly. "A week ago I was on a stagecoach, excited about starting a new chapter in my life. Then there was terror and despair, and now—" She trailed off. "Now," Ethan prompted, finally turning to look at her. "Now I'm not sure what comes next," she admitted. "But I'm alive, thanks to you, and that's something to be grateful for." Ethan nodded, seeming uncomfortable with her gratitude. "You would have found a way out," he said. "I just made it a bit easier." Tessa smiled. "You underestimate what you did for us, Mr. Irwin." "Ethan," he corrected. "After what we've been through, I think we can dispense with formalities." "Ethan," she repeated, liking the sound of it. They reached Brownsville by early afternoon. The town was larger than Tessa had expected, a proper frontier settlement with several streets of businesses, a church steeple visible above the rooftops, and the bustle of commerce everywhere. After the isolation of the past few days, the sight of civilization was both comforting and overwhelming. Ethan led them directly to the doctor's office, a tidy, whitewashed building near the town square. Dr. Samuel Wilson was a middle-aged man with spectacles and a kind face who took one look at Lucia and immediately cleared his examination room. While the doctor tended to Lucia, Ethan took Tessa and the other women to the sheriff's office. Sheriff James Blackwell was a tall man with a silver mustache who listened gravely to their account of what had happened. "I've been hearing reports of these slave traders operating along the border," he said, making notes in a leather-bound book. "They're getting bolder, attacking stage coaches now." He looked up at Ethan. "You say you killed some of them?" "4 confirmed," Ethan replied evenly. "Wounded at least 2 others. And you just happened to be in the area?" the sheriff asked, a hint of suspicion in his voice. "I was tracking them," Ethan said. "Been on their trail for 2 weeks after they hit a settlement near Fort Clark." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "You working for someone official, Irwin? Last I heard, you'd left the Rangers." "I'm working for myself," Ethan replied coolly. "Same as always." There was clearly history between the two men, and Tessa sensed tension crackling in the air. Before it could escalate, she stepped forward. "Sheriff, these men murdered at least 4 people that I know of and were planning to sell us into slavery," she said firmly. "Whatever your feelings about Mr. Irwin's methods, he saved our lives. Surely bringing these criminals to justice is more important than old grudges." Sheriff Blackwell studied her for a moment, then sighed. "You're right, madam, my apologies." He turned back to Ethan. "Can you mark on this map where the attack happened and where you found their camp?" As Ethan leaned over the map with the sheriff, Tessa took the opportunity to speak quietly with Alina, Sophia, and Maria. The 3 Mexican women were understandably anxious about their situation. They had been visiting relatives north of the border when they were captured, and now they worried about getting home safely. "We will help you," Tessa assured them. "Either the sheriff can arrange an escort or—" She glanced at Ethan, wondering if he would be willing to extend his protection further. After they finished at the sheriff's office, they returned to the doctor's to check on Lucia. "Doctor." Wilson had set her ankle, confirming it was indeed broken, and treated the infection that had begun to take hold. "She'll need to stay off that foot for at least 6 weeks, the doctor explained. "The break isn't too severe, but any weight on it could cause permanent damage." "She can stay with me," a voice said from the doorway. They turned to see a middle-aged woman with a pleasant face and practical clothing. "I'm Sarah Wilson, the doctor's wife. We have a spare room, and I could use some help with sewing while she recovers." Lucia, who understood some English, looked relieved at the offer. After a brief conversation in Spanish with Alina translating, she gratefully accepted. With Lucia's immediate future settled, they turned to the question of accommodations for the rest of them. The sheriff had suggested the Brownsville Hotel, but Ethan shook his head. "Too public," he said. "If any of those men survived and made it to town, that's the first place they'd look." Instead, he led them to a modest boarding house on a quiet side street run by a widow named Mrs. Fletcher. After explaining a simplified version of their situation, the kind-hearted woman immediately offered them 2 rooms, one for the 3 Mexican women and another for Tessa. "And where will you stay?" Tessa asked Ethan as they stood in the boarding house's small foyer. "I know a place," he said vaguely. "I'll meet you here in the morning. We need to figure out next steps." Before he could leave, Tessa impulsively caught his arm. "Thank you, again, for everything." Ethan looked down at her hand on his arm, then met her eyes. Something passed between them, a current of understanding, perhaps, or something deeper that neither was ready to name. "Get some rest," he said softly. "You're safe now." After he left Mrs. Fletcher showed Tessa to her room, a simple but clean space with a comfortable-looking bed, a washstand, and a small window overlooking the street. After helping Alina, Sophia, and Maria settle into their room, Tessa finally found herself alone. The events of the past few days crashed over her like a wave. She sank onto the bed, her composure finally cracking as tears came. She cried for the dead driver and guard who had tried to protect them, for the terror of being bound and treated like merchandise, for the uncertainty of what still lay ahead. But mixed with the tears of fear and grief were tears of relief and gratitude for her survival, for Ethan's timely arrival, for the kindness of strangers like Mrs. Abernathy and Mrs. Fletcher. When the tears finally subsided, Tessa washed her face and changed into a nightgown Mrs. Fletcher had lent her. As she lay in the unfamiliar bed, she found her thoughts returning to Ethan. What kind of man devoted his life to hunting down criminals when he could have settled somewhere, built a normal life? There was clearly more to his story than he had shared, and she found herself curious to know what drove him. Morning brought clear skies and renewed determination. After breakfast with Alina, Sophia, and Maria in the boarding house's small dining room, Tessa went to check on Lucia at the doctor's house. She found the young woman comfortable and already helping Mrs. Wilson sort fabric scraps for quilting despite her injured ankle. "The doctor says I am lucky," Lucia told Tessa in halting English. "The break is clean. It will heal well." "I'm so glad," Tessa said, squeezing her hand. "We'll make sure you get home safely once you're recovered." When she returned to the boarding house, she found Ethan waiting on the porch, speaking with Sheriff Blackwell. Both men looked serious, and Tessa's heart sank, sensing bad news. "What is it?" she asked, joining them. "2 of the men from the auction were spotted in town this morning," the sheriff said grimly. "They were asking questions at the hotel about new arrivals, especially women traveling alone. They're looking for you and the others," Ethan added. "The sheriff's deputies are searching for them now, but they might have already left town," the sheriff finished, "or gone to ground somewhere." Tessa felt cold fear returning. What about Alina, Sophia, and Maria? They were planning to start for home today. "That would be unwise," Sheriff Blackwell said. "I've arranged for a proper escort, but they won't be ready to leave until tomorrow at the earliest." "And what about you, Miss Morgan?" Ethan asked. "You said your destination was San Antonio?" Tessa nodded. "My uncle is expecting me, or was. I don't know if word has reached him about the stagecoach attack. We sent telegrams to San Antonio yesterday," the sheriff informed her. "If your uncle is a banker named William Morgan, he should have been notified by now." "I should continue my journey then," Tessa said decisively. "I've imposed on everyone's kindness long enough." "I'll take you," Ethan said, the words coming out before he seemed to realize he'd spoken them. When both Tessa and the sheriff looked at him in surprise, he added, "I'm heading that direction anyway." "And given the circumstances, traveling alone wouldn't be safe." Sheriff Blackwell frowned. "Irwin, I thought you were planning to track down the rest of that gang." "They'll keep," Ethan replied. "And from what you've said, at least some of them are here in Brownsville." "That's your jurisdiction, not mine." The sheriff looked like he wanted to argue but merely sighed. "Your choice, I suppose. When do you plan to leave?" "Tomorrow morning," Ethan said, glancing at Tessa for confirmation. "Early." Tessa nodded her agreement, feeling a strange mixture of relief and anticipation at the prospect of traveling with Ethan. The journey to San Antonio would take several days, even riding hard. She tried to tell herself her quickened pulse was simply due to the prospect of finally reaching safety, but she knew that wasn't entirely true. After the sheriff left, Tessa and Ethan sat on the boarding house porch, planning their journey. They would need supplies, and Tessa would need more suitable clothing for travel. Her borrowed dress wouldn't hold up on the trail. "I can advance you some money," Ethan offered. "You can repay me when we reach your uncle." "That's very kind," Tessa said. "But I actually have some money sewn into the hem of my original dress. Not much, but enough for necessities." Ethan looked impressed. "Smart thinking." "My father always said a woman should have resources of her own," Tessa explained. "He made sure I knew how to manage money and insisted I always keep some hidden away for emergencies." "Sounds like a wise man." "He was," Tessa said softly, feeling the familiar pang of grief. "I miss him terribly." Ethan was quiet for a moment, then asked, "What was he like, your father?" The question surprised Tessa. Ethan hadn't struck her as someone who engaged in personal conversations easily, but she welcomed the chance to speak about her father. "He was a professor of literature at Harvard," she said, smiling at the memories. "Brilliant, kind, always with his head in a book. My mother died when I was very young, so it was just the two of us. He raised me to be independent, educated me himself until I was old enough for formal schooling." She paused, remembering. "He used to say that books were windows to other worlds, but that I should never forget to look out my own window as well, to experience life, not just read about it." "Is that why you decided to come west?" Ethan asked. "To experience life?" Tessa considered the question. "Partly, I suppose." "After father died, staying in Boston felt hollow. Everything reminded me of him. When Uncle William wrote about the opportunities in Texas, it seemed like a chance for a fresh start. Father would have approved, I think. And now, after everything that's happened, now I'm even more determined," Tessa said firmly. "I refuse to let fear dictate my choices." Ethan studied her with that intense gaze of his. "You're remarkably resilient, Miss Morgan." "Tessa," she corrected with a small smile. "After what we've been through, I think we can dispense with formalities." Ethan's mouth quirked in recognition of his own words from the day before. "Tessa, it is." They spent the afternoon making preparations. Ethan purchased supplies while Tessa, accompanied by Mrs. Fletcher for safety, bought sturdy traveling clothes, split skirts that would allow her to ride astride, several shirts, a vest, and a wide-brimmed hat to protect against the sun. She also found a serviceable revolver that fit her hand and a belt holster to carry it. When she joined Ethan outside the general store, dressed in her new attire, he gave her an appraising look. "You look ready for the trail," he commented, helping her secure her packages to the horse Mrs. Fletcher had arranged for her, a gentle mare with a smooth gait. "I am," Tessa replied confidently, though inwardly she felt a flutter of nerves. She had ridden plenty in Boston, but always in controlled settings with proper riding habits, never across open country dressed like a frontierswoman. That evening, they had dinner with Alina, Sophia, and Maria at the boarding house. The three women would be leaving for their homes near the border the following day, escorted by 2 deputies and a guide who knew the territory well. There were tears and embraces as they said their goodbyes, the shared ordeal having forged a bond between them despite language barriers and cultural differences. "Be safe," Alina said, hugging Tessa tightly, "and be happy. You deserve happiness after such suffering." "So do you," Tessa replied, returning the embrace. "All of you." That night, Tessa found sleep elusive. Her mind raced with thoughts of the journey ahead, of the danger that might still be lurking, and increasingly of Ethan Irwin. There was something about him that pulled at her, a depth of character, a complexity that intrigued her. Despite his reserved nature, she'd caught glimpses of compassion, intelligence, and even humor beneath the tough exterior. Morning came with a soft knock on her door. It was Mrs. Fletcher, bearing a tray with coffee and biscuits. "Thought you might want something before you set out," the kind woman said. "Mr. Irwin is already downstairs, checking the horses." Tessa thanked her and quickly ate, then gathered her few belongings. As she prepared to leave the room that had been her sanctuary, however brief, she paused at the small mirror above the washstand. The woman who looked back at her was changed from the one who had boarded the stagecoach in El Paso. Her face was more tanned, her eyes somehow older, but there was also a new determination in her expression that hadn't been there before. "Ready for a new chapter," she murmured to her reflection, then turned and headed downstairs. Ethan was waiting in the yard, their horses saddled and ready. Thunder stood patiently beside Tessa's mare, which she had named Willow for her gentle nature. Saddlebags bulged with supplies, and bedrolls were secured behind the saddles. The sheriff came by, Ethan informed her as she approached. They caught one of the men who was asking questions yesterday. He won't be causing any more trouble. And the other left town, apparently, heading east, which is good we're going north. Tessa nodded, trying to push away the unease the news brought. Then we should be fine, after thanking Mrs. Fletcher for her hospitality and saying final goodbyes. They mounted up and rode out of Brownsville as the sun crested the horizon. The town quickly fell behind them as they followed the northbound trail toward San Antonio. The first day's ride was uneventful but tiring for Tessa, who wasn't accustomed to spending hours in the saddle. By mid-afternoon, when they stopped to rest the horses near a small creek, she was trying hard not to show her discomfort. "Your muscles will adjust," Ethan said, noticing despite her efforts. "First day's always the worst." "I'm fine," Tessa insisted, stretching surreptitiously as she dismounted. Ethan handed her a canteen. "No shame in being saddle sore. Even experienced riders feel it after a long break." As they sat in the shade of a cottonwood tree, sharing jerky and hardtack, Tessa found herself wanting to know more about the man beside her. "You mentioned you were with the Rangers for a time," she said. "Why did you leave?" Ethan was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, "They have rules, procedures. Sometimes those get in the way of justice." "And you prefer to operate without rules?" Tessa asked carefully. "I have rules," Ethan corrected. "They're just my own." He took a drink from his canteen. "There was a case of family massacred near Fort Worth. Mother, father, 2 children. We knew who did it, had witnesses who placed the men at the scene, but there was a technicality evidence collected improperly or some such nonsense. They walked free." "What did you do?" Tessa asked, sensing there was more to the story. "What the law couldn't," Ethan said simply. "The Rangers didn't approve of my methods. We parted ways after that." Tessa absorbed this information, trying to reconcile it with her own beliefs about law and justice. "You believe the end justifies the means. In some cases, yes," Ethan replied, meeting her eyes steadily. "Not all cases, but when innocent lives are at stake, when the system fails those it's meant to protect, then someone has to step in. Like you did for us," Tessa said softly. "Like I did for you," he agreed. They continued their journey, making camp that evening in a small grove of trees near a stream. Ethan built a fire while Tessa arranged their bedrolls on opposite sides of the flames. As darkness fell, the vast Texas sky opened above them, stars scattered like diamonds on black velvet. "It's beautiful," Tessa said, gazing upward. "I've never seen so many stars." "One of the benefits of being out here," Ethan replied, handing her a cup of coffee. "No city lights to dim the view." As they sat by the fire, the conversation flowed more easily than before. Ethan told her about his travels the mountains of Colorado, the deserts of Arizona Territory, the vast plains of Kansas. Tessa shared stories of her teaching days, of the bright young minds she'd encountered, and the joy of seeing understanding dawn in a child's eyes. "You miss it," Ethan observed. "Teaching." "I do," Tessa admitted. "I hope to find a position in San Antonio eventually. My uncle wrote that the city is growing rapidly and there's demand for qualified teachers." "You'll find your place," Ethan said with certainty. "You have a strength about you that's rare." The compliment warmed Tessa more than the fire. "Thank you. That means a great deal, especially coming from someone as self-sufficient as you." Ethan smiled, a real smile that transformed his face, softening the hard angles and lighting his eyes. "Self-sufficient, maybe, but there's a difference between being alone by necessity and by choice. Sometimes I wonder if I've forgotten the distinction." The vulnerability in his admission surprised Tessa. "It's never too late to remember," she said gently. Their eyes met across the fire, and something shifted between them, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits despite their different paths. The moment stretched, filled with unspoken possibilities, until Ethan cleared his throat and stood. "We should get some sleep," he said. "Long ride tomorrow." Tessa nodded, though sleep seemed suddenly distant. As she settled into her bedroll, she was acutely aware of Ethan's presence across the fire, and of the strange new feelings stirring within her feelings she hadn't expected to discover on this journey. The next morning dawned clear and cool. They broke camp efficiently, falling into an easy routine as if they'd been traveling together for weeks rather than days. Ethan was impressed by Tessa's adaptability. She never complained, even though he knew she must be feeling the effects of yesterday's ride. As they followed the trail northward, the landscape began to change, the flat terrain giving way to gentle rolling hills dotted with oak and mesquite. They passed occasional farmsteads and crossed paths with other travelers, traders heading south, farmers taking goods to market, a mail coach bouncing along the rutted road. Around midday, they stopped at a small trading post to rest the horses and replenish their water. The proprietor, a grizzled old-timer with one eye, greeted them warily until Ethan mentioned Sheriff Blackwell from Brownsville. James Blackwell, the man said, suddenly more welcoming. He and I served together during the Mexican War. Any friend of his is welcome here. Inside the trading post, which doubled as a rudimentary tavern, they found a few other travelers taking refreshment, a pair of cattle buyers discussing prices, a young couple who appeared to be newlyweds heading to start a homestead, and a solitary man in a dark coat who sat in the corner, his hat pulled low. Something about the man in the corner set Ethan's instincts on edge. He positioned himself so he could keep an eye on the stranger while he and Tessa ate a simple meal of beans and cornbread. "Is something wrong?" Tessa asked quietly, noticing his distraction. "Not sure," Ethan replied. "Just being cautious." They finished their meal quickly, and Ethan paid the proprietor, asking casually, "That fellow in the corner, he been here long?" The old man glanced over. "Showed up this morning. Hasn't said much, just ordered whiskey and watched the door." Ethan nodded, his suspicions growing. "We'll be on our way then, thanks for the meal." Outside, he hurried Tessa to their horses, keeping his voice low. "Mount up quickly, I think we might have company." Tessa's eyes widened, but she followed his instructions without question, swinging into Willow's saddle with newfound ease born of necessity. They were just turning their horses toward the trail when the stranger emerged from the trading post, his hand moving toward his hip where a revolver was holstered. "Hold it right there, Irwin," the man called, his voice carrying across the yard. Ethan's hand hovered near his own weapon. "You have business with me." The man stepped forward, and Tessa gasped as recognition dawned. It was one of the traffickers from the auction, a lean, hard-faced man with a scar running through his left eyebrow. "You killed my brother," the man snarled. "Shot him right through the heart while he was just trying to make a living. Kidnapping women and selling them isn't making a living," Ethan replied coldly. "It's a one-way ticket to hell." The man's face contorted with rage. "You're the one heading to hell today." His hand moved for his gun, but Ethan was faster. In one fluid motion, he drew and fired, catching the man in the shoulder of his gun arm. The trafficker's shot went wild as he stumbled backward, his weapon falling from nerveless fingers. Ethan dismounted swiftly, kicking the fallen gun away and training his revolver on the wounded man. "How'd you find us?" he demanded. The man clutched his bleeding shoulder, hatred burning in his eyes. "Followed your trail from Brownsville." Wasn't hard, not many lone men traveling with pretty redheads these days. From inside the trading post, the proprietor emerged with a shotgun. "What in tarnation is going on out here?" "This man is wanted for murder, kidnapping, and slave trading," Ethan explained, not taking his eyes off the wounded trafficker. "I'm bringing him in." The old trader lowered his shotgun slightly. "Slave trading, we don't take kindly to that around here." With the trader's help, they secured the trafficker with rope and loaded him onto his own horse. Ethan explained the situation to the couple and cattle buyers, who had also come outside at the sound of gunfire. The young husband volunteered to ride to the nearest town with a sheriff's office, about 10 miles east, to report the incident and arrange for the prisoner's transport. "We'll keep him secure until the law arrives," the trader promised, gesturing with his shotgun. "You two best be on your way in case he has friends nearby." Ethan agreed, and soon he and Tessa were back on the trail, riding at a faster pace than before. They didn't speak until they had put several miles between themselves and the trading post. How likely is it that he was working alone? Tessa finally asked, her voice steady despite the close call. Not very, Ethan admitted. These men usually operate in groups, and from what he said about his brother, he has personal motivation for revenge. Then we should expect more trouble, possibly. But we're also getting closer to more populated areas. They're less likely to try something where there are witnesses. They pushed on until dusk, covering more ground than they had planned for the day. When they finally made camp in a defensible position among some rocks, Tessa was visibly exhausted but still insisted on helping with the preparations. As they sat by the fire later, Ethan noticed she was unusually quiet. "You all right?" he asked. Tessa looked up from the flames. "I'm trying to reconcile the woman I was a week ago with the woman I am now," she said thoughtfully. The Tessa Morgan who left Boston would never have imagined she'd be sitting by a campfire in Texas after witnessing a shootout. "Regrets?" Ethan asked, something like concern in his voice. "No," Tessa said firmly. "Strange as it may sound, despite everything or perhaps because of it I feel more alive than I ever have, more present in my own life." She gave a small laugh. "Is that odd?" "Not at all," Ethan replied. "Danger has a way of stripping away pretenses, showing what truly matters." "And what truly matters to you, Ethan Irwin?" Tessa asked boldly, her eyes reflecting the firelight. Ethan was silent for a long moment, considering the question. "Justice," he finally said. "Freedom. The right of people to live without fear." He paused. "And lately I've been thinking there might be more to life than just the next hunt, the next wrong to right." "What more?" Tessa prompted softly, his eyes met hers across the fire. "Connection," he said simply. "A place to belong. Someone to return to." The weight of his words hung in the air between them, charged with meaning. Tessa felt her heart quicken as she recognized the longing in his voice, a longing that echoed her own growing feelings. "Those are worthy things to want," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are they possible for someone like me?" Ethan asked, more vulnerability in the question than she'd ever heard from him. "I believe everyone deserves a chance at happiness," Tessa replied, "even former rangers with their own code of justice." A small smile touched Ethan's lips. "Even kidnapped schoolteachers with more courage than sense," Tessa laughed, the tension breaking. "Especially them." The moment passed, but something had shifted between them, an acknowledgement of possibilities that hadn't existed before. As they settled into their bedrolls for the night, Tessa found herself thinking not of the danger they'd faced or might still face, but of the quiet strength in Ethan's voice when he spoke of connection, of belonging. And for the first time since her father's death, she allowed herself to imagine a future that held more than just independence and career, one that might include partnership, companionship, perhaps even love. The third day of their journey brought them into more populated country. They passed numerous farms and ranches, crossed a busy stage-coach road, and by afternoon could see the distant smudge on the horizon that Ethan identified as the outskirts of New Braunfels, a German settlement about 30 miles from San Antonio. "We could push through to San Antonio tonight," Ethan suggested as they watered their horses at a stream, "but it would mean arriving after dark. Might be safer to stop in New Braunfels and finish the journey tomorrow morning." Tessa nodded, secretly relieved. Though she was eager to reach her uncle, she was also increasingly aware that arrival would mean parting ways with Ethan. The thought brought an unexpected pang of regret. "New Braunfels sounds wise," she agreed. "Better to approach San Antonio when we're rested." They reached the town by early evening. New Braunfels was a tidy settlement with strong German influences evident in its architecture and the signs above many businesses. The streets were clean and orderly, the residents industrious and friendly. They found accommodation at the Hoffman Hotel, a well-kept establishment near the town square. For the first time in days, they would have proper beds and hot baths, luxuries that Tessa had never appreciated quite so much as she did now. After settling their horses at the livery stable, they went to the hotel's dining room for supper. The room was cheerful and busy, filled with the sounds of conversation and the clatter of dishes. Several patrons glanced their way with curious expressions, a travel-worn man and woman making an unusual pair. "I must look a sight," Tessa said self-consciously, smoothing her rumpled clothing. Days on the trail had left them both dusty and disheveled. "You look fine," Ethan assured her. "Better than fine." The unexpected compliment brought color to Tessa's cheeks. Before she could respond, a waitress approached their table, bringing plates of schnitzel, sauerkraut, and boiled potatoes that smelled heavenly after days of trail food. As they ate, Tessa found herself studying Ethan's face in the warm lamplight of the dining room. Without the constant vigilance of the trail, he seemed more relaxed, the hard lines of his face softening as he enjoyed the good food. She noticed details she hadn't before: a small scar near his right temple, the way the corners of his eyes crinkled slightly when he was pleased, the streak of gray at his temple that spoke of experiences beyond his 30-some years. "You're staring again, Miss Morgan," Ethan said, echoing his words from days earlier, but this time with unmistakable warmth in his voice. "Just thinking," Tessa replied, smiling. About how much has changed in such a short time," she said truthfully. "And how, despite everything, I'm glad for this journey." Ethan's expression grew serious. "Even after all the danger, even then," Tessa confirmed. "I've learned more about myself and others in these past days than in years of comfortable living in Boston." "And what have you learned about others?" Ethan asked, his voice low. Tessa met his gaze steadily. "That appearances can be deceiving, that a man who chooses to live outside society's boundaries can still embody its highest ideals, that courage and compassion often come from unexpected sources." Ethan was silent for a moment, then said quietly, "And what have you learned about yourself?" "That I'm stronger than I knew," Tessa replied. "That I can face fear and not be consumed by it, that my heart." She paused, suddenly unsure of her boldness. "That my heart is capable of feelings I didn't anticipate when I began this journey west." The meaning behind her words hung in the air between them, neither quite ready to acknowledge it directly yet both aware of its presence. Ethan's hand moved across the table, hesitantly covering hers. "Tessa," he began, but was interrupted by the arrival of the waitress with coffee and apple strudel. The moment passed, but the connection remained, a tangible thing that colored their conversation through dessert and followed them as they retired to their separate rooms. At her door, Ethan paused. "One more day," he said, his voice carrying a note of regret. "We'll reach San Antonio by noon tomorrow." "Yes," Tessa agreed softly, "just one more day." They stood there, the unspoken hanging heavy between them until Ethan finally stepped back. "Good night, Tessa." "Good night, Ethan." Inside her room, Tessa moved to the window, looking out at the starlit town square. Tomorrow she would reach her destination, the new life she had set out to find. But in the space of a week, her vision of that life had transformed. The independent existence she had planned now seemed hollow without the man who had saved her, challenged her, and she was beginning to realize, captured her heart. Morning came with clear skies and the promise of an easy final leg of their journey. They breakfasted early, both quieter than usual, the impending separation casting a shadow over their meal. As they prepared to check out of the hotel, the desk clerk handed Ethan a telegram that had arrived for him. Ethan read it quickly, his expression growing serious. "It's from Sheriff Blackwell," he said, showing Tessa the paper. "The man we left at the trading post escaped during transfer to Brownsville. They believe he and at least 2 others are heading towards San Antonio." Tessa felt a chill. "They know that's where we're going." "Seems likely," Ethan confirmed grimly. "We need to be extra vigilant today." They set out immediately, taking a less direct route than planned, one that would keep them off the main roads where an ambush would be easier to set. The detour would add time to their journey, but both agreed the caution was warranted. The morning passed tensely, both scanning their surroundings constantly as they rode through wooded areas and across small streams. By mid-afternoon, they could see San Antonio in the distance, its buildings rising from the plain, the towers of the old Spanish missions visible on the outskirts. "Almost there," Ethan said, relief evident in his voice. They were crossing an open stretch of grassland, perhaps 5 miles from the city, when Ethan suddenly reined in thunder, holding up a hand for Tessa to stop as well. His eyes narrowed as he studied the tree line ahead. "What is it?" Tessa asked, her hand moving instinctively to the revolver at her hip. "Movement in those trees," Ethan said quietly. "Might be nothing, but—" Before he could finish, a rifle shot cracked through the air and dirt kicked up just feet from Thunder's hooves. The horse reared, but Ethan kept his seat, quickly guiding the animal toward a shallow depression in the ground that offered some cover. "Down," he shouted to Tessa, who was already urging Willow toward the same protection. They dismounted in the depression, which provided minimal shelter, little more than a dry creek bed that put them below the sight line of their attackers. 2 more shots rang out, hitting the ground nearby. At least 2 shooters, Ethan assessed, drawing his rifle. Probably the men Blackwell warned about. "What do we do?" Tessa asked, keeping remarkably calm despite the danger. Ethan studied their surroundings. The depression ran roughly parallel to the tree line where the shots had originated, offering a potential route to flank their attackers. "I'm going to work my way along this creek bed and come around behind them," he explained. "You stay here with the horses, keep low." "No," Tessa said firmly. "I'm not waiting here while you face them alone." Ethan started to argue but saw the determination in her eyes. "All right," he conceded. "But stay behind me, and if I tell you to run, you run for San Antonio. No arguments." Tessa nodded her agreement, though privately she had no intention of abandoning him. They moved carefully along the dry creek bed, staying low to avoid being spotted. The shooters fired occasionally, apparently trying to keep them pinned down while conserving ammunition. After several tense minutes, they reached a point where the creek bed curved away from the tree line. "We need to cross open ground now," Ethan whispered. "About 30 yards to those rocks, then we can circle behind them." "I'll follow your lead," Tessa replied, checking her revolver. Ethan counted silently, then surged from the creek bed in a crouched run. Tessa followed close behind. Almost immediately, shots rang out, but the distance and their moving targets made accuracy difficult for the shooters. They reached the rocks unscathed, both breathing hard from the sprint. 3 of them, Ethan confirmed, having caught a glimpse of their attackers during the dash, including the one from the trading post. They worked their way around the rocks, using the terrain for cover as they circled behind the tree line. The plan was working. They could now see the backs of the 3 men, who were still focused on the creek bed where they believed Ethan and Tessa remained hidden. Ethan raised his rifle, taking careful aim. "Drop your weapons," he called out. "You're surrounded." The men whirled in surprise, but instead of surrendering, the one with the shoulder wound, clearly the leader shouted an order, and they scattered for cover. Gunfire erupted as both sides exchanged shots. Tessa, despite her limited experience with firearms, managed to keep her composure. When one of the men broke cover and tried to flank them, she fired, her shot catching him in the leg. He fell with a cry, his weapon skidding away. "Good shot," Ethan called, impressed. The firefight continued for several more minutes, each side jockeying for position. Then, unexpectedly, hoofbeats sounded from the direction of San Antonio. A group of riders was approaching at speed, at least 6 men, all armed, reinforcements. Tessa asked hopefully. "Let's find out," Ethan replied, keeping his rifle trained on their attackers. The approaching riders proved to be a patrol of Texas Rangers, responding to the sound of gunfire so close to the city. Their arrival quickly ended the standoff. The traffickers, now outnumbered and surrounded, surrendered. As the Rangers took the men into custody, their leader approached Ethan and Tessa. He was a tall man with a silver star pinned to his vest and a face weathered by years in the saddle. "Ethan Irwin," he said, recognition and something like grudging respect in his voice. "Still finding trouble, I see, Captain Henderson," Ethan greeted him. "Trouble seems to find me." The Ranger captain turned to Tessa. "Madam, are you hurt?" "No, Captain, thanks to Mr. Irwin's quick thinking." Captain Henderson nodded. "We received a wire from Sheriff Blackwell in Brownsville warning that these men might be heading our way. Seems we arrived just in time." "Your timing was impeccable," Ethan agreed. With the immediate danger past, they retrieved their horses from the creek bed and joined the Rangers for the final ride into San Antonio. Captain Henderson expressed interest in taking their full statements at the ranger's office, but first agreed to escort Tessa to her uncle's home. William Morgan's residence proved to be a handsome two-story house on one of San Antonio's better streets, set back from the road behind a neat garden. As they approached, the front door opened, and an elderly gentleman hurried down the path, his face alight with relief. "Tessa, thank God," he exclaimed, embracing her as she dismounted. "When I received word about the stagecoach attack, I feared the worst, Uncle William," Tessa said, returning his embrace. "I'm so sorry to have worried you." "Nonsense, child, the important thing is that you're safe." He turned to Ethan and the Rangers. "And I have you gentlemen to thank for that, it seems." Introductions were made, and William Morgan insisted they all come inside for refreshment while Tessa explained what had happened. In his comfortable parlor, over glasses of good whiskey and tea for Tessa, the entire story was related: the stagecoach attack, the auction, Ethan's timely rescue, and their journey to San Antonio. William Morgan listened with growing amazement and gratitude. "Mr. Irwin," he said when the tale was complete, "I am forever in your debt. You saved my niece from a fate I cannot bear to contemplate." "She saved herself as much as I saved her," Ethan replied honestly. "Your niece is one of the bravest people I've ever met." Tessa felt warmth rise to her cheeks at his praise. Throughout the telling of their story, she had been acutely aware of Ethan beside her, of the imminent parting that would follow these formalities. The thought left an ache in her chest that not even the joy of reunion with her uncle could dispel. After taking their statements, Captain Henderson and his men prepared to leave, the prisoners in tow. "Irwin," the captain said as he was departing, "if you ever reconsider your position about rejoining the Rangers, my door is open. We could use men with your skills." Ethan nodded in acknowledgement, but made no promises. When the Rangers had gone, William Morgan insisted Ethan stay for dinner, an invitation he accepted after only a brief hesitation. While Tessa went upstairs to bathe and change into clean clothing that her uncle had procured for her arrival, Ethan and William spoke privately in the study. When she returned, refreshed and dressed in a simple but elegant blue dress, she found them in seemingly cordial conversation. Dinner was a pleasant affair, with William asking many questions about Boston and mutual acquaintances there. Throughout the meal, Tessa was conscious of Ethan watching her, his eyes often finding hers across the table. There was something in his gaze that hadn't been there before, a question, perhaps, or a decision being weighed. After dinner, William excused himself, claiming fatigue but giving Tessa a meaningful look that suggested his departure was deliberate. Alone in the parlor, Tessa and Ethan stood by the fireplace, the comfortable silence of days on the trail now replaced by a tension neither quite knew how to address. "Your uncle is a good man," Ethan said finally. "You'll be safe here." "Yes," Tessa agreed. "Thanks to you," Ethan shook his head. "I meant what I said earlier. You saved yourself as much as I saved you. You're remarkable, Tessa Morgan." "Where will you go now?" she asked, unable to keep the question inside any longer. "I'm not sure," Ethan admitted. "Captain Henderson's offer is tempting in some ways. The Rangers do good work, despite my past differences with them." "You'd be excellent at it," Tessa said sincerely. "You already are, with or without the badge." Ethan took a step closer to her. "There are other considerations now," he said quietly. "Things I've been thinking about since Brownsville, since before that, if I'm honest." Tessa's heart quickened. "What things?" "Remember what I said by the campfire, about connection, belonging, someone to return to." Ethan's voice had grown softer, more intimate. "I've been alone a long time, Tessa, by choice mostly, but these past days with you, they've reminded me of what I've been missing." Tessa found herself moving closer to him, drawn by the emotion in his voice. "And what have you been missing?" Ethan's hand rose to gently touch her cheek. "This," he said simply. "The way you look at me like I'm more than just a gun, the way you challenge me, the way you make me want to be better than I am." "You already are good, Ethan Irwin," Tessa whispered. "I've seen your heart." His eyes searched hers. "I know it's fast, too fast, maybe. We've known each other barely a week, but sometimes a week can change everything." "Yes," Tessa agreed, her own voice barely audible. "It can." "I don't have much to offer," Ethan continued, No fine house, no steady income, just a man who's trying to find his way to something better. That's more than enough, Tessa said, reaching up to touch his face in return. I didn't come west looking for luxury. I came looking for purpose, for a life that matters. And have you found it? Ethan asked, his face inches from hers now. I'm beginning to think I have, Tessa replied, and then his lips were on hers, gentle at first, then with growing passion as she responded eagerly to his kiss. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Ethan rested his forehead against hers. I need to know this isn't just gratitude, he said. That what you feel is real. Tessa smiled, her heart fuller than she could ever remember it being. It began as gratitude, perhaps, she admitted. But it grew into something much more powerful with every mile we traveled together, every conversation we shared, every danger we faced side by side. What are you saying, Tessa Morgan? Ethan asked, a smile beginning to form on his lips. I'm saying that I've fallen in love with you, Ethan Irwin, Tessa declared boldly. And that if you'll have me, I'd like to be that someone you return to, no matter where your path leads. The smile that broke across Ethan's face was like sunrise after the darkest night. I love you too, he said, the words sounding as if they'd been waiting a lifetime to be spoken. And I'd be honored to come home to you always. He kissed her again, and in that moment, all the fear and danger of the past week faded away, replaced by the promise of a future neither had imagined when their paths first crossed. From the doorway, William Morgan watched with misty eyes, unobserved by the couple. He quietly retreated, his heart full of gratitude that his beloved niece had not only survived her ordeal, but had found love in the most unexpected of circumstances. Over the weeks that followed, Tessa settled into life in San Antonio. Her uncle, delighted by her presence, introduced her to the city's society and arranged for her to meet the school board, who were impressed by her credentials, and quickly offered her a teaching position for the coming term. Ethan, after much consideration and several long conversations with Tessa, decided to accept Captain Henderson's offer to rejoin the Rangers. His experience and skills were valuable, and the captain was willing to overlook past differences in exchange for Ethan's commitment to working within the system. The arrangement allowed Ethan to be based primarily in San Antonio, though his duties sometimes took him away for days or weeks at a time. When he returned, he always came first to the schoolhouse where Tessa taught, watching from the doorway as she guided her students through their lessons with patience and passion. 6 months after their arrival in San Antonio, on a crisp autumn evening, Ethan took Tessa to the garden of the old Spanish mission where they had often walked together. Under the stars, with the scent of late roses in the air, he knelt before her and offered a simple silver ring. I'm still not a wealthy man, he said, and this life I lead isn't always easy or safe, but everything I am and everything I have is yours if you'll share your life with me. Yes, Tessa said without hesitation, tears of joy shimmering in her eyes as he slipped the ring onto her finger. 1,000 times yes. They were married in the mission church the following spring, with William Morgan proudly giving the bride away and Captain Henderson standing as Ethan's best man. Among the guests were Mrs. Abernathy from the homestead near Brownsville, who had traveled all the way to San Antonio for the occasion, and Alina, Sophia, Maria, and Lucia, all safely returned to their homes and thriving after their ordeal. Sheriff Blackwell sent his congratulations by telegram, along with news that the remaining members of the trafficking ring had been captured and would face justice. Mrs. Fletcher from the boarding house sent a handmade quilt as a wedding gift. After the ceremony, as they greeted their guests in the mission garden, Tessa leaned close to her new husband. Do you remember what you said to me when you first cut me free from that wagon? She asked softly. Ethan smiled, remembering. I said you're free because I'm here. Tessa shook her head, her eyes full of love. I thought that's what freedom meant, then escape from danger, but now I know better. She took his hand, placing it over her heart. True freedom is this loving and being loved, finding home in another person's heart. Then we're both free, Ethan said, drawing her close for a kiss that promised a lifetime of tomorrows. In the years that followed, their love only deepened, Ethan continued his work with the Rangers, his reputation for integrity and justice growing throughout Texas. Tessa became headmistress of San Antonio's first school for girls, where she instilled in her students the same courage and independence that had seen her through her own trials. They built a modest home on the outskirts of the city, with a wide porch where they often sat in the evenings, watching the sunset and sharing the stories of their days. In time, children joined them, first a son with Ethan's quiet strength and Tessa's thoughtful nature, then twin daughters who inherited their mother's auburn hair and their father's determined spirit. On the 10th anniversary of their first meeting, Ethan surprised Tessa with a journal bound in soft leather. Inside, he had written their story, beginning with that fateful day when he had spotted the auction and ending with their wedding day. "So our children will know where they came from," he explained as Tessa turned the pages, tears in her eyes. "So they'll understand that sometimes the darkest moments can lead to the brightest futures. And so they'll know that true love can be found in the most unexpected places," Tessa added, closing the journal and leaning into her husband's embrace. "That sometimes being captured can lead to the most perfect freedom of all." As the sun set over their home, casting long shadows across the porch where they sat surrounded by the family they had created, Ethan and Tessa Irwin knew that the journey that had brought them together, with all its danger and fear, had been worth every step. For it had led them home to each other, to a love that had transformed them both and would continue to sustain them through all the adventures still to come.